Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's presentation about the ABMI's Biodiversity Intactness Index, brought to you by Brandon Allen. Brandon has provided quite the mouthful of an introduction for himself, so bear with me here. He is an applied ecologist with the ABMI. His current focus is on the reporting and development of biodiversity and landscape-based indicators for regional planning initiatives. Indicator development is a collaborative process that includes multiple stakeholders within the government of Alberta. Technical documentation, case studies, and open discussion between all stakeholders is required for the development of scientifically defensible indicators. His research focus is varied, ranging from the genetic consequences of harvest in Alberta's walleye fishery and the distribution of hybridization in the threatened West Slope cutthroat trout, all the way to investigating the relationships between invasion, land cover, and water chemistry and wetland vascular plant assemblages. Brandon completed his BSc in ecology and an MSc in evolutionary biology from the University of Calgary. And just finally, before we begin, I'd like to also say that the ABMI respectfully acknowledges that our work takes place on the territories of Treaties 6, 7, and 8, the traditional and ancestral lands of First Nations and Métis people, whose histories and languages and cultures are directly connected to the biodiversity that we monitor. We acknowledge the traditional teachings of the lands and that we acknowledge the traditional teachings of the land that we work on, and that reciprocal, meaningful, and respectful relationships with Indigenous peoples make our work possible. We are committed to supporting Indigenous-led monitoring programs and learning Indigenous ways of knowing, being, and doing. So with that, I will let Brandon take it away.
Thank you, Brett. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about the ABMI's Biodiversity Intactness Index. This is going to be a fairly high-level overview. There's lots of nitty-gritty details that kind of goes into making this index. So again, if you have any questions, feel free to add into the chat, and I'm more than happy to talk with anybody after the presentation as well if you have questions. So very quick, ABMI 101, as Brett said, the goal of the ABMI is to track changes in Alberta's wildlife and their habitats from border to border. And we want to provide ongoing relevant and scientifically credible information on all of our living resources. We try and do this through a few core operating principles. So we are an independent arm's-length organization. We highly value scientific credibility. We're often publishing papers and working with collaborators and other NGOs and government to make sure that what we're doing is credible. And the big thing we're focusing on these days is making sure that the data we provide and the products we create are relevant, accessible, and transparent. So making sure that, like for this indicator, that everybody can take a look at it, can understand what goes into it, how it's created, and then all of that little nuance that you need to understand if you're going to be using this information to make land use decisions in the province. So here at the ABMI, we monitor a lot of different species. So if you went to the ABMI biodiversity browser, you can see a subset of the species that we've detected in the province. So to date, there's almost a little more than 3,400 species that have been detected. This includes amphibians, we have birds, bryophytes, vascular plants, soil mites, mammals. And this website doesn't have yet all the aquatic invertebrate stuff that we also do. So add a few hundred to maybe 1,000 more species on top of that. So we have just a treasure trove of biodiversity data in the province. And this is a great resource. When you click on it, you can understand, where is elder flycatcher in the province? Where is the deciduous stands? Where is this rare soil mite I'm interested in? However, we do need to try and synthesize this into something that can be actionable. If you're only interested in conserving one species, this is great. But again, if you want to manage all of biodiversity, clicking on these pages and trying to summarize it in your head is really challenging to do. So the way that this is often done through most organizations is creating what are broadly called environmental indices. So the goal of any environmental indices is just to synthesize some really complex information into something that's understandable as well as actionable. So this is a small list of indices I pulled from the GeoBond website, which is a global biodiversity tracking group. And Again, this is not the complete list of indices that are out there, but they all are trying to capture one aspect of biodiversity. So some are focused on, identifying where are protected areas, what is the connectedness of habitats, where are invasive species or places that are at risk of becoming colonized by these invasive species. We have species habitat indices, species status assessments, and each one of these pieces kind of feeds into our general understanding of what is happening in the environment. And again, so even though these are all really complex, each one of these in turn provides that novel information that can help inform land use management or conservation priorities. So our main environmental indice, and again, this is just one of the many that the ABMI produces and reports on, is the Biodiversity Intactness Index. So in simplest terms, this index, often sometimes called the BII index, just tries to estimate, what is the estimated abundance of a species present in natural habitats, and what if we compared that to a state where there was disturbance. So it's really just saying, how many alder flycatchers were in this forest under natural conditions, and then how many would be there if it became disturbed, if we put a parking lot in that forest, if we put a harvest area in that location as well. So it's quite a simple index. It's used by lots of groups. So again, we at the ABMI use it. And I say at the local scale, but we are monitoring the province. So saying that almost 700,000 square kilometers is local is maybe a bit of a stretch. But there are other groups that do it at global scales, and other jurisdictions across the world do use this index as well, or a variant of it. So it was first proposed in 2005. There have been lots of minor tweaks and iterations, but overall the core messaging is the same. Again, it's just comparing how many species are there under natural conditions to a state where there was some sort of disturbance. So again, this sounds really straightforward to calculate, but there is a lot of work that goes into getting all of the data that is necessary to calculate an index like this. So the first step is we need the species data. So at ABMI, we have our systematic grid. So this is 1,656 sites spread out on the province on a 20 square kilometer grid. And at each location, we have what we call kind of an upland site or a terrestrial site, as well as a targeted wetland location. So at each of these sites, we collect a ton of information. So again, this is where we're deploying ARUs or autonomous recording units to capture the calls of amphibians and birds. We have remote cameras to look at mammals. We have soil protocols for soil mites, all of the aquatic inverts and vascular plants and mosses. And this list is continually expanding as well. So we have this lovely grid across the province that we are constantly surveying. And then on top of this, we do a lot of work with other academics and as well as other environmental nonprofits to get data from their surveys as well. So just trying to think in your mind that you have, almost 1,600 sites where there's a terrestrial site and a wetland site, plus you have other surveys from groups like eBird or iNaturalist, and this becomes a huge data set of where species are in the province. And once you know where species are in the province, we have to figure out a bunch of information about that. So the first thing we want to do is figure out the disturbance that has occurred at the locations that we've surveyed. So the main way that we monitor disturbance right now at the ABMI is through the human footprint inventories. So you can find these online on our website. These are kind of provincial scale data sets that are integrating data from various different sources, and it helps map the superficial to human disturbance across Alberta. So this is represented, we call them disturbance classes or feature types. So it might be, a 3-lane highway or a 6-lane highway or a seismic line or a rough pasture, or tame pasture. We have all these different disturbance types, and we wrap them up into these broad categories. So we might just look at well sites, and this could be active gas wells, this could be abandoned wells. But each one of these pieces of information tells us something about the location that we surveyed. So we have a location, we find that maybe a species is present there, but is there a well pad? Is there a harvest area nearby, or is it undisturbed natural habitat? So this is, again, really great information about disturbances. It doesn't get at things such as pollutants. So we're not talking about kind of those diffuse pressures of like oil spills or those types of pollutants that can exist on the environment. This is really just focusing on habitat loss and transformation. So we know where the species are, we know the footprint that is there. The other thing that we need is the land cover. So at ABMI, we have an internal integrated vegetation and soil layer that we use. So this is just trying to represent, what is the native vegetation that is present there. So let's, is there a bog? Is it a fen, a swamp? Is it a 40-year-old deciduous stand? Is it a 60-year-old mixedwood? And so we have over 30 vegetation classes now that are all trying to get different aspects of the environment. And on top of that, we also have soil classes. So in the kind of the parkland and grassland natural regions of the province, we rely heavily on soil information to create our models. And so, we like to model aspects such as, is it a rapid drain soil? Is it a clay soil? And that gives us a better understanding of where species are occurring within those areas of the province. And so when we're talking about this land cover, we have kind of two states of it. So as I mentioned, for the Intactness Index to work, we compare, the current abundance of a species to a reference state of some sort. And the way that we define our reference state is the landscape in the absence of human footprint. So we're not talking about some theoretical reference. We're not saying this is the landscape pre-colonization or, with a theoretical fire scenarios that are happening. This is really just the current landscape, and then we try and backfill in what that footprint replaced, essentially. So there are lots of times where we do know what was there prior to disturbance. So when harvesting happens, we can generally know that it is going to occur in an upland forest of some sort. So the harvesting would occur in a deciduous stand or a mixedwood stand. In some cases, we are able to know, we have expansion of agriculture fields, and they are taking over native grasslands. And so those ones are relatively easy to stitch together. Sometimes it's a bit more challenging. We might not have accurate data going back, prior to, 2000, or even to like going way back in time to 1950s kind of thing of trying to understand what habitat was there prior to disturbance. So we do have what we call this backfilling process, where we try and fill in these gaps based on logical kind of processes. So you might have a case where, say we have the seismic line, we don't know what was there beforehand, but all around the seismic line is treed bog, and it's treed bog for kilometers and kilometers. So we will make the assumption then that seismic line likely disturbed a treed bog in that case. So we have, all this great information. We have the species data that ABMI collects on the left. The second figure starts representing all the species data that's collected through all of these other resources, such as eBird and iNaturalist and all of our other partners. We know the footprint that is occurring at those locations, and we also know the land cover at those locations. And with all this information, we can finally make what is known as a species distribution model. So I think I've said all the flycatcher a few times. I like this bird. It's a great bird for talking about. And so what we do, we take all this information, we make some fairly complex models, and these models then describe to us the habitat associations for that species. So in this example here, we can see that alder flycatcher generally seems to prefer younger, like deciduous stands and mixedwood stands. You can tell that by the higher bars on those habitat types. And you can get a lot of really interesting nuance. So we can start looking at these comparisons of, maybe they prefer young mixedwood stands, but they don't like old black spruce stands. Maybe they prefer shrubby fens are okay, but they don't like crops or urban industrial types of footprint. So this is a really kind of like high-level overview of a species ecology of what habitats do they prefer? Are they more or less abundant in certain habitats or others? And this is where you can get some really cool patterns. So for this species here, they do seem to prefer young harvested stands. So these dots that you see over top of the white spruce, pine, and deciduous stands, those represent harvested areas. So for this species, young harvested forests seem to be beneficial for them. But if we're able to take that same forest and replace it with a shopping mall, the species isn't going to occur there. So again, it's always a bit of nuance of each species responds positively and negatively to some types of footprints depending on the habitat it likes to occupy. So with that model, this is where we can finally start getting at the current reference states that we are interested in. So again, focusing on the current state. So this is taking the landscape as is as of 2021. So this is all the natural land covers, all the fires that have occurred on the landscape, plus all the disturbance that currently existed as of 2021. And we use all of those habitat associations that we developed in our model to predict where we think the species is occurring. So you can see in the middle figure here, alder flycatcher is fairly high abundance in kind of central Alberta. It doesn't occur in the grasslands or in most of the Rocky Mountains. And you can kind of see this like patchy distribution depending on the age of the forest stands that it likes to occupy. So then going back to that reference state that I talked about, again, this is taking that land cover layer with the footprint on it, and we have nibbled in or using the data that's available to us, figured out what the natural land cover was prior to disturbance. So this is the landscape as it would be today if no disturbance had taken place. And again, you can see that there's lots of places that it's still highly abundant. You will notice that there are locations such as, if you focus on the north central part of the province, there's these kind of big red blobs that are consistent in current and reference. And that's because those are natural stands. They haven't been disturbed. So the species is just as abundant under this reference condition as it would be under the current condition because there is no disturbance there. And with this, then we can make our difference maps. So this is kind of, again, a high-level overview showing where alder flycatcher is predicted to be increasing in the province. So you can see kind of throughout the foothills, we're predicting some increases, but there are all of these little sections where we are predicting declines. So going back to alder flycatcher, young harvested stands are very beneficial for this species. So we're seeing all of these increase in kind of the foothills parts of the province. But footprint types such as crop and agriculture, this species doesn't respond positively to it. So we get all of these little patchy areas where the species is predicted to be declining. So with those large provincial maps that we have, this is where we can finally get down to the nitty-gritty numbers of calculating intactness. So as I said, we take that reference landscape. So in this simple example here, without any disturbance in the landscape, we have 21 birds occurring in this area. We then make the prediction for the current landscape and we say, well, we've added some disturbance and the birds don't like it. So maybe there's only 14 under the current landscape. So intactness is just represented as the ratio of the two. So the current condition divided by the reference condition gives you a result of 67%. Now, the one kind of nuance here that we have is that we do try and track if species are increasing because of disturbance or decreasing. So this ratio here, sometimes it'll flip. So in this case here, we say it is the current condition divided by the reference to get us 67%. But if the species was increasing, we actually flip that ratio. And what this means is that our index is kind of restricted between 0 and 100%. So it doesn't matter if you have decreased 20% or increased 20%, you're still going to be reported in this index as 80% intact. This was done for a very deliberate reason. We didn't want species that are increasing because of land use changes to be able to counteract the changes or the declines for some other species. And so this is really just representing the deviation that is occurring on the landscape. So again, 80% intact for one species might mean that they've declined. For another one, it might mean that they're actually increasing. But this deviation is what we're concerned about and what we're trying to manage. So all of that work was to create a single species model and intactness for one species. This is done right now. We have almost 1,000 species models that we've developed. So take all of those steps of getting the occurrence data and cleaning it and processing it and the footprint data, do that 1,000 times to get a model for each species. And we can get these high-level intactness figures that we have here. So this is showing you the intactness of the 6 taxonomic groups that we have models for. So again, birds, mammals, soil mites, vascular plants, mosses, and lichens. And on this figure here, you can actually see those differences of some species are increasing. So looking at birds, you can see that there are some that are higher than 100%. But again, as from an intactness standpoint, we're reporting them as still less than 100. So you can kind of see the bars here start at 100 in the center, and then they both go to 0 as they get really high or really low. But this is kind of the cool thing. So we have for each taxonomic group, we have a bunch of different species. We can aggregate that. So within a taxonomic group, we can say, birds are 98% intact, or vascular plants are 70% intact. Maybe lichens are 60% intact, but we can understand how each taxonomic group is doing. And then we aggregate those values across the groups. So we take the average of birds, mammals, lichens, mosses, and so on to get a singular intactness value for the whole state of biodiversity in an area of interest. So we've done this again we deliberately chose to average in this way because we think all wildlife and biodiversity should be treated equally. And we don't have an equal number of species for each of these taxonomic groups. We don't have a lot of mammals in the province, especially when we compare it to vascular plants. So we want to make sure that each taxonomic group is kind of equally represented in our final indicator. So in this case here, we can say intactness in this area of interest is 94%. But this is just the start of it. So this indicator is kind of really flexible. We can subset it in lots of really cool and interesting ways. So if anybody here on this presentation has visited the ABMI Wetland Atlas, you would have maybe seen this figure. So we took all of this intactness information and we actually subset it for bryophytes, so mosses, and wanted to understand if certain mosses were having greater or less impacts based on the disturbance that was happening. So we separated them out based on which habitats they were first, so bogs and poor fens, rich fens, swamps, marshes, and generalists. So again, you can kind of start to see cool patterns where even though we're looking at the same area of the province, you can tell that the species that occupy bogs and poor fens are generally more intact than the generalists or the ones that occupy swamps and marshes. So this is where you can start to dig into some of the cool things of, are there certain types of disturbance that are occurring more or less in certain habitat types? Is it occurring within a part of the province that, those specialists just so happen to occupy? Did you perform some sort of, seismic line grid in an area that just, again, happens to have a rare bryophyte or moth that happens to like that habitat? So this is where you get all this interesting nuance occurring. And you can subset this in lots of different ways. So we've looked at the intactness of old forest birds. So often for forest management, those species are quite important. So we can kind of subset out those species in particular. We don't have to stick to subsetting out species into different groups, but we can look at different areas of the province. So we can look at, what is the intactness of species within national parks? What is the intactness of species across different counties? And we can kind of do endless subsetting, endless possibilities with this indicator. So if there's a part of the province you're interested in and there's a suite of species you're focused on, this indicator can be aggregated to kind of meet those needs. So some of the strengths. So again, this indicator is scientifically a defensible index. It's been published in the literature for many years now in lots of high-profile journals. It's being adopted by more and more organizations. So it is an index that is fairly well defensible at this point. It is really good at condensing all that species information to represent, the status of biodiversity for a large number of species. It's, having a single number to say that all of wildlife is, 95% intact can be challenging, but because we're able to kind of scale it up in all these different ways, we can keep some of that really interesting nuance kind of available to decision makers so that they know maybe on average things are doing okay, but maybe there's some old forest bird species that are not doing so great, and maybe there's additional efforts that need to be considered when managing those species groups. This indicator is great for assessing changes over time. So we are able to calculate this index for any current state. So we can calculate what is intactness in 2010 and 2020, and this can go forward as far as we would like. So you can start tracking those changes over time as well, which is really interesting. And being a modeled indicator, it is great that as we get new data, new modeling methods are developed, and new geospatial data becomes available to us, that we can improve these models, and then we can still recalculate everything. So we can go back and say, how did things actually look in 2010 now that we have some more data to create a better model in those cases. Again, there are some limitations. The pros of it being a model indicator are, you could say the same for it's a limitation. It doesn't actually, it's not tracking the true trend in species abundances over time. It's trying to predict that. And trying to monitor the whole province, it can be very challenging to accurately monitor trend over time. So this is a kind of a valuable way to do it, but again, just acknowledging it's a limitation. Like any environmental index, it is just one aspect of biodiversity. This index, and really any index, shouldn't be used as the singular answer for all of your management questions. It's just one piece of this kind of biodiversity puzzle that we're working on. Currently, the indicator is insensitive to those diffuse pressures that I mentioned. So again, we're not modeling the impacts of pollutants in the environment, be it noise, light, or other contaminants in the system. And it's something that we're trying to look at how we can better capture some of this information. So things such as, landscape configuration might be really important for some species. And that can be more of a diffuse pressure that can give us a better representation of what the actual status of biodiversity is in Alberta. And with any modeled indicator, it's just dependent on the available species and kind of remote sensing data that you have access to. So I think anybody who has done wildlife surveys knows, as much as we like to think that they are 100% accurate all the time, things happen. Methods are not always 100% precise. When we're dealing with remote sense data, they're really accurate, but again, they're often not 100% accurate. So there always is a bit of wiggle room and improvements that are always happening to try and kind of minimize the amount of error that's in those data sources. But it's just good to acknowledge that, again, this is not a perfect representation of biodiversity on the landscape. It is just one measure that can be used, and I would argue should be used to help inform management decisions. So this indicator has been used in lots of applications. So if anybody that's on the call has visited the ABMI website and looked at our reporting section, you'll see that we've talked about intactness at our wetland atlas of Alberta project that we did. There's a few different status of land covers reports that were done for the Alpac region as well as the Norbord region as well. And these give some really high level overviews about what is the state of biodiversity or the intactness of biodiversity in these regions. You can pick out individual species to understand, which species of interest is increasing or decreasing within the region. They also go into some really kind of more nuanced results as well. They start teasing apart some of the differences of, is change on the landscape occurring because of new development, or with, the recent forest fires that have been happening in the province. Are there larger changes because of forest fires that are happening instead? So it is really, really cool information. Again, it's all public and out there for anybody to read and take a look at. And one of the things that we're trying to do right now is figure out and understand how we can make this information more accessible. So it's nice to know what the status of wetlands is for all of Alberta, or if you're really interested in some of these forest management areas. But we would like to make this information more accessible to everybody. So if they're interested in, how their county is doing, or how the area around a national park is doing, that information can be more accessible to them. So that is something we're actively working on right now. So that, I just want to thank everybody for showing up today. Again, this was a fairly high-level overview. I'm happy to answer any questions you have, and if it's a nitty-gritty model question, I can try and answer it here, but I'm, again, also happy to talk about it at a later date as well. So Thank you very much.